This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Hello everybody and welcome to the James Bond Book Club, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Laurence Boyce, who is a writer and film programmer, and we're going to be talking about Anthony Horowitz's novel Trigger Mortis. Hi Laurence, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to talking about a newer Bond book.
And we were talking off microphone earlier about how this sort of comes, it's kind of a little bit of an outlier when we look at the Bond continuation novels.
I think so. It's interesting about, obviously, the works of Benson and Gardner and Amis, that they tend to be, as we call them, the Bond continuation novels. They take the character from what Fleming did. I think even Faulkner stuff like Solo and Devil May Care was set closer to Bond at the time, but it was still separate adventures after Man with the Golden Gun. Sure, some people might correct me if I'm wrong. But what is interesting about Horowitz and his work is that they are specifically set within the continuity of Fleming's original novels. So Future Works Forever and a Day is meant to be a prequel to Casino Royale. His latest, he says at the moment, last Bond book, A Mind to Kill, is a follow-up to Man with the Golden Gun. And Trigger Mortis, that we're talking about today, in some ways a direct sequel in the fact that it happens directly after Golden.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny this, because I used to run a parody news site called studioexec.com, and I remember once doing a story, which again was, obviously it was a parody, it wasn't real, but, you know, Moonraker 2 is in production, and, you know, describing how, the joke was, of course, you never have a sequel to a James Bond book or film because they're standalone, because they're all sequels to each other. They're a series rather than a sequel. The notion of sequel is redundant. And then I watched Quantum of Solace, and actually Quantum of Solace is a kind of direct sequel. You are running straight on from one film to the other, and you're kind of Quantum of Solace is supposed to be very much sort of part two of Casino Royale. And when I read Trigger Mortis, I had the same feeling that this was a direct run on. There were things which were being resolved and played out in a way that James Bond novels usually compartmentalize their stories. You'll have like a character mentioned, or, you know, oh, did you hear about that Thunderball episode that was in the news last year? I was involved in that. You'll have that sort of information. I think that's referred to in the Spy Who Loved Me, if my memory serves me. But it won't be. There'll also be a sense of there's a bit of a firewall, but between these adventures.
I think yes and no. I mean, I think one of the things about what is interesting about the continuation novels, just in general, what they have to contend with is that after looking at Fleming's original run, Fleming had to contend with himself and the legend of James Bond that he wrote. He died, in 1964, so around 1964, if I'm correct. You might correct me if I'm wrong, but it was only then that Bond started to become famous cinematically. In other words, Bond was a cultural icon, but mostly a literary icon, and one that Fleming himself had created. Whereas what all the future authors have to grapple with, I think, is Bond as a cultural icon. Not just Fleming's Bond, but people think of Bond as Fleming, of the product of the films, of the cinema, of everything like that. And it is in a way harder to approach Bond because again you have way much more cultural baggage than Fleming ever had because the cinematic Bond, no matter what people try and do, weighs heavy upon what we believe is Bond as a cultural character and an icon. And to very deliberately put it into the Fleming world and say this is a continuation of a Fleming novel almost seems a bit of a statement as well. This isn't cinematic James Bond. This is Fleming's Bond that we're definitely working with. And it is also that whilst you say that, especially the movies are almost compartmentalized, I think there's an argument, obviously, for the Craig movies being much more of a series in development. I think it was talked about before in the James Bond book, but before, it is surprising when you read all the novels in order that there is development of Bonds, that they work in their own worlds, but there isn't as much of a reset button as, say, the Bond films do. The Bond films end, let's start again, pretend nothing happened, at least in the, say, up until Dalton and Brosnan era, where the films were things in and of themselves and they didn't really need to reference anything else, apart from very complicated things about Bond's wife and Jaws turns up again and all that kind of stuff. There are continuity moments, but they've never been a huge part of the films. But with this one, by specifically, I think, putting it within Fleming's world, there is a specific, this is Fleming's Bond. And I think a lot of the hype around it when it was first released, because it's 10 years for this book. This is the 10-year anniversary of Trigger Mortis. It's partly to do with its so-called fealty to the work of Fleming. And indeed, the fact that Horowitz uses some of Fleming's original works that hadn't been discovered at the time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I want to definitely get onto that a little bit in a moment. I think you're right. Actually, I'm going to take back what I said. I think one thing we did discover through the James Bond Book Club was that sense of much more consistency, and of course, the compartmentalization of the cinematic Bond is to do with having to change actor every 5 films or so, and so having a feeling that we can't make this too much of an episodic thing because at some point the actor's contract is up and they're not going to renew necessarily. The Craig Bond is the exception that proves the rule, and no more so than the final episode, of course.
Yeah.
Which
there's a specific beginning and an end to Craig's Bond. That's it. There's a start and a finish.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. So let's get on to Anthony Horowitz. Have you read any of his other books, by the way? I mean, he's a hugely successful writer in his own right.
Yes, I actually grew up liking Horowitz because he wrote a great series of books about what was called the Diamond Brothers, sort of kids' detective stories. And if anybody's out there, I think it was mid-'80s, he was made into a film and a TV show called Just Ask a Diamond. And I think it's one of those great lost British films in the mid-'80s. If anybody searches out Just Ask the Diamond based on Horowitz's books, it's actually really good. And so I grew up knowing Horowitz's work because of the Diamond Brothers detectives that he wrote about. And then, of course, I've always, I've never read the Rider series myself, personally, that he's done, but I knew about his work on Foyle's War. He helped others. He's had form with continuation novels before because he did a couple of Sherlock Holmes.
The House of Silk.
The House of Silk.
Yeah.
He's a very good, very dark piece of work. He's done his own murder mystery novels. He's always been a very good writer and a very good TV writer as well. Very good sort of TV writer, showrunner. So I was aware of his stuff. And me being a Bond fan when he was first announced, it seemed a very good fit, I think. And I think the book proves that just about he was.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I find it interesting as a sort of test case as well of writers, that it's interesting how they fail, because there is an inevitable failure because of the contradictions that are inherent in the project. You're never going to please everybody, because if you write too closely to Ian Fleming, you're just going to come off as pastiche. If you diverge from Fleming, then you're going to upset people who want to read another Fleming novel. So I think he does a very good job of being quite close to Fleming. I have some problems, and we'll get onto them in a moment. I think there are certain inconsistencies in the Bond that Fleming does and the Bond that Horowitz has his own Bond. But in a sense, I don't even think that's necessarily a problem. Just as an actor will have his own interpretation, so a writer maybe should.
I mean, I think it's also important to say, for me, when I approach this novel, there is something I find interesting about this being a continuation of Goldfinger, which, when I approach this again, is that I took part in the last James Bond book club and talked about Octopussy, and with that, I decided to reread all the Flemings. Just to, it had been a while. And with that, approaching this again, the thing that I realized is that, and it is interesting how I think it affects how I read this novel, is that I do not like Goldfinger. If I think of the Fleming's run, I think, for me, it is the quotation marks worst. I can see the good points in it, but there were talks about how sometimes trying to take back some of the things that I said about Fleming, it was terrible with female characters, unabashed racist, unabashed homophobe, all the things that are problematic with Fleming. And I know during the last, we agree that those all exist, but Fleming was better than sometimes people say. And that there are things to find and things to talk about. And that way of talking about Fleming is very reductive. However, I believe Goldfinger is Fleming at his worst excesses. That if you want to look at the things where Fleming is told, or you're told by the orthodoxy, this is why Fleming was bad, I think it's all evident in Goldfinger.
The Korean hatred, for which he had particular animus.
The worst. The cats do not get off very well in Goldfinger. You have the entire relationship between Pussy and Bond is completely unbelievable in that book. She basically turns up 2/3 in and goes, hello, and jumps into bed with him near the end with no build-up whatsoever. You have the problems of ridiculous plotting of Bond being Goldfinger's secretary all of a sudden. And it just seems to me that everything that could be leveled against Fleming, the worst except. And there are good moments in Goldfinger. I'm not saying there's some great stuff in there, but I also think there's some poor stuff. I think people might argue Man with the Golden Gun could be a worse book, or it's not as accomplished, but Goldfinger is meant to be Fleming on his absolute uppers. Man with the Golden Gun was a man who was sadly dying, knew about his mortality, and if things are to be believed, wasn't edited very well because it was edited after his death, and it wasn't, it was a very much a first draft work. Whereas Goldfinger should have been Fleming on his absolute apex. And I just don't think it's that novel. And I do think it's interesting how Horowitz contends with not only the novel itself and the actual what the novel does, but again, the entire cultural icon of that is Bond, and tries to fix a couple of things, I think, within Goldfinger as well. But we will get on to that. But it's interesting how my approach to the original Fleming also, not necessarily clouded my approach, but it made it interesting about how I read what Horowitz was doing.
Interesting that it brings up it's one of the best films as well for my money. I mean, Goldfinger is because you don't really have those problems seem to be ironed out, with the exception of the Pussy Galore.
But I think I think that's the irony, because with the irony of Goldfinger is the Bond film. Goldfinger is the one where the formula of what Bond was set. You have Oddjob as now became the atypical henchman. You have Pussy Galore with the Bond girl with the vaguely risque name. And even the Honor Blackman's portrayal of that is still a hell of a lot better, and you still believe a little bit more than you do the book about her and Bond's relationship in the film. The point about Goldfinger is that it completely codifies what we see as all the cliches of Bond. That even somebody who's never watched Goldfinger before will know bits about it, know lots about it, because that was the film. that really absolutely made the Bond formula what it is. And so I think because the film itself has such a cultural cachet that within what the Bond formula is, that, and again, as the films went on, they started to less and less adapt the work directly. And while there's a lot of direct adaptation in Goldfinger, you know, from the card game, from certain things, there is a lot of stuff that is taken from the original novel. It irons out a lot of the problems that I think the novel has. And I think that the very idea of just Goldfinger just says a lot about what Bond is, but people sometimes haven't read the original novel. And when you actually read the original novel, at least for me, there are a hell of a lot of problems, even though there is some good stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting, because it was one of the books that took a while for somebody to when I sent out the original list, it wasn't one of the books that was picked up immediately by anyone, and I think Rob Pork did it in the end. I'm not even sure if it might have been his second choice. You know, he was sort of like, I'll do anything, whatever you. So yeah, it's interesting that you. I don't think I'm quite as down on it. I think there are several things. I like the remorsefulness of it. But anyway,
there are things that, because I think it's also because it's interesting in how it relates to Trigger Mortis, and I think how people approach that. Because if we, as you're mentioning, now if you look at the prologue, so there's a really interesting prologue about somebody meeting in a bar, and it's obviously an enemy agent and all this kind of stuff, and it's a very good and interesting sort of prologue. But there's also a very interesting bit, which I think informs the rest of the book and how it's going to go. Which is when the character of Keller? When Keller says, by the way, if you think you're going to kill me or I have written everything that we're doing down, where, if I am found dead in mysterious circumstances, my friend is going to send a letter with photographs and names and everywhere. What you immediately have is that in normal Fleming books, that Keller would be dead. They would give him the money, he would have his throat slit, and he would be like Domino's brother in Thunderball, or countless other people who worked for the bad guys and then got eliminated straight away. What you have here is a genre-savvy character. Already somebody going, I know what's going to happen. You all really want to kill me. Well, that's not going to happen, because I know how bad guys get off by the major organization. You already have this little bit of playfulness with the character, knowing I'm expendable here because that's what happens. And I think that's going to start to inform the rest of the book. And I also do like the idea that then it all goes off the rails because it's his wife who gets pissed off with him and ends up offing him, which I think is really funny. Yeah, if you know what I mean. The idea behind it is really fun.
It gives us a sense of where we are in time and place as well. There's a real sense of, and I quite like the structural thing of having a prologue, because we do have these in Fleming, but this feels more like a modern novel prologue rather than it doesn't. It's not like From Russia with Love, where you have a really substantial part of the. I guess it's most like Diamonds Are Forever in that it's just a separate sort of chapter incident which will inform the rest of the story, will connect later.
It's because, as we'll see, it's very much a book of two halves.
Yes.
And I think early Fleming was never really like that. Early Fleming was a bit it was always, but I mean, early Fleming was also very, very Bond, in the sense that, if I'm right, you don't get another character's perspective till about 2.5 novels in. Like Casino Royale, Bond is in every scene. Diamonds Are Forever, Bond is in from every scene, and everything is from his perspective. And it's not until Moonraker and there's a moment with Gala Brand when she's by herself is the first time that Fleming has ever talked about somebody else with Bond not being there.
Yeah, Live and Let Die is the second novel, isn't it? And I don't think that has anyone else except
because there's
Bond.
Even bits, if you think about Live and Let Die, there's the attack on the train when Bond and Solitaire have escaped. But the entire thing with that is they're being told that by Felix. Yeah. Even in Casino Royale, there's the bit when when Vesper and Bond are kidnapped by the chief. You don't cut to Vesper, but you only find out what happens to her when Bond escapes and she tells him what happens. So for the first novel, for the first few ones, it's always immediate and then Fleming starts to experiment with taking the narrative away from Bond. And then you have something from Russia with Love where the entire first third there is no Bond in sight, and this is where I think Horowitz is being playful. The idea that, because as we will see at the start, you think this has nothing to do with it. It seems to go in a completely different direction, but it still sets up things well. And again, this idea of having this character who is quite genre savvy Because he might as well say, I know what happens in these type of books. I know what happens in these type of things. You're going to want to kill me. And it's immediately this playing with our expectation and what we see and what we believe is going to happen, because we come into books like this nowadays 50 years, 60 years since Fleming first wrote them.
We have the prologue in which secrets are being sold, and a sort of a fiendish plan is being, as you say, immediately derailed by what seems to be a domestic murder. Then we go to Bond, and we find him in London in between jobs in the aftermath of the Goldfinger affair. And there is this kind of funny idea of, we've always had this in Fleming, that there will be a reference to the girl from the last novel. What is Tiffany Case doing with Bond now? What is Honeychild doing? Where do they go on holiday and then go their separate ways? Or what happens? Do they get tired of each other? And here it's sort of Pussy Galore, and I think I know what you're going to say here as well about sort of like if we're going to take Fleming curing Pussy Galore's lesbianism, well, the cure didn't stick, so to speak.
I think so, but it's interesting reading some contemporaneous reviews of Trigger Mortis, because one of the things he points out is like, and Trigger Mortis, does what Fleming never did, which is, what happened after the Bond girl moves in with Bond or stays with Bond, shows the aftermath. But it's not true. Fleming, whilst he didn't go in as much detail as Horowitz does here with Pussy Galore, there were mentions of Tiffany Case. There were, Honeychild Ryder is mentioned to have got married. They're not totally ignored by Fleming.
No,
this is just a little bit more, looking at it's an unsurprising, not necessarily breakdown of a relationship. It's just they end up living together, doing some actual practical stuff. Yeah, James Bond has helped save the world, been saved by a criminal, and then he brings the criminal home to live with him. And it turns out that MI5 and the Foreign Service are not actually too happy with that. And actually, then we go, hang on a second. This might not be too good, James. We don't want to get involved with your personal life, but maybe an international criminal living in your house.
Yeah, and the Americans are circling. They want to ask her a few questions.
And you do have this nice, sort of. They obviously, you can tell that they have a bit of fun together, but now they're getting bored. Bond does his work and will not do his work, and his work is boring. It's the Fleming's Bond who only actually ever so often goes out and does a mission and spends most of his life going to Universal Exports and reading reports and all that kind of stuff, then coming home again to do whatever. It's all a bit dull. And then he gets even, I'm off to go do some motor racing now. I'll leave it in my hotel, but it is an interesting idea, because you could tell that would actually happen. They would have fun for a little while, and then it's a bit like, okay.
I wonder, I was wondering when I was reading it, whether sort of Pussy would stay for the whole adventure, whether she would sort of show up, become something of a sidekick. And I was also wondering if, the other alternative was potentially to sort of kill her off as a way of sort of giving Bond an emotional imperative to go. But it's almost like he's kind of served his own sauce, because there's a sense of, Pussy Galore falls in love with someone who, or is attracted to and cops off with someone who Bond has his eyes on, and it happens very quickly, and it's like, oh, okay, and he's sort of. It's a bit of a crude phrase, but he's kind of cock-blocked, isn't he?
In a way, but I think he's quite gentle. I think it feels like a fix of Fleming's Goldfinger. Because partly, if you look at Fleming's Goldfinger, even the way Pussy and the Thingy come together, he sees Pussy, the first time he meets her, she's part of the crime syndicate heads. Then he meets her during the Fort Knox thing, and then she's on the plane, and by the time he's on the plane, which is near the end of the novel, now she suddenly fancies him. This is like the absolute characterization of that is just out of nowhere. She suddenly fancies Bond for no seeming reason. Whereas I think he's quite gentle here, and again, when I say sort of fixes it, it is a little bit of, hey, James, we had fun for a few weeks. I know I've just met her, but let's face it, me and you just met, and Bond seems a little bit more sanguine about it than he might be he would have probably been in Fleming's works. He seems a little bit like, oh, well, good for them.
This leads on to a point I wanted to make about this is where, for me, the Horowitz version of Bond diverges a bit from the Fleming, because Horowitz sort of insists several times that I haven't got time to settle down. One woman's no good for me. I'm not I'm not the marrying kind. And he does this thing that actually in Fleming he kind of doesn't do. But if anything, in Fleming he's more, I wouldn't mind marrying every single woman I meet.
But I think it is also, I agree with you to a certain point, but I also think it starts to become more of a character trait after Goldfinger and as we move towards On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I think I agree with what you mean. He's just, the famous bit that people forget a bit, totally made into a puppy at the end of Moonraker and stuff like that by Garner Brown saying, yeah, bye, no, thank you, not interested. But I just about believe it in terms of the character of Bond where he was in Goldfinger. We actually take that there is some character development with that. Now, again, and this is going to become more in the novel as well, you have, I think, this tension throughout the novel between wanting to be like Fleming, but you're writing Fleming in the modern age. There's a bit he mentions, I think, in the, I think I'll read you, and this, links in with the description of how sort of he fixes Pussy Galore's character. Because if that is Pussy Galore's character after Goldfinger, at least it makes it a little bit more than, Bond comes to cure a lesbian. It's a lot more, she's got a lot more of the agencies just saying, You know what, it was a bit more of a fling, but actually I found this really cute woman, I'm going with her. But in the acknowledgements, if I can find it, Horowitz here himself says, and again, I think this informs the book as we're going to talk about it. I had tried to stay true to his original vision and to present the character as he was conceived back in the 50s. Whilst hopefully not upsetting too many modern sensibilities. And I think that continues to inform what Bond is throughout this book, and we'll come to a few examples of that later, that a lot of what Bond does that we find unpalatable in the original Bond books, there's always a tension between, was that Fleming, was that Bond, or is it a bit of both? A lot of Bond's attitude towards women, towards gay people, towards race and all that kind of stuff are very much found within Fleming's views as well. Especially now Fleming passed away and we know a lot more about him, biographies and things like that. Whereas you have Horowitz trying to write a character who he might not share as many views and things like that with him. And I think he continues on throughout this novel. And like I say, I think he is a bit more sanguine about I think it also works on this level that he wants to get rid of Pussy. To be quite frank, he talks about that, and he's basically had his fun. If you're a bit crude about it as well, he's had his fun. And whilst he didn't get together with, I've forgotten her name now, the character, was it Lainey? I can't remember the name of the character. It's managed to let him Pussy go off, and he's free.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a clearing of the decks, if you like. And to move on to what you're saying about, part of the fun of this novel is definitely sort of guessing which part is Fleming and which part is Horowitz, because there is some actual Fleming in here. There is a sort of short story Fleming wrote for a TV pilot, and Horowitz sort of uses it as a chapter.
Yeah, because I think it's chapter 7, Murder on Wheels, is the large part of it that he took. Obviously, this was the James Bond TV series that formed a lot of the stories from For Your Eyes Only. And apparently, whether they've always been there or they've just been discovered, there are a few more. And Fleming wanted to indeed put it into the world of motor racing. And as Pussy goes on her way, he decides to go and save the world from Smersh winning a race, apparently. It is a bit of a clunky setup. No, it sort of, again, has been done with Fleming before. Moonraker, which is basically, you actually think about the start of that book, which is basically M going, I don't like people cheating at cards. You will help me stop somebody cheating at cards. The setup here is a little bit like Smersh want to win a race and will probably kill somebody. It seems very unambitious of Smersh, but they try and explain why it's important and Smersh are going to do this and why they're going to send Bond off to do some motor racing. It, again, is a little clunky, and it does feel slightly, we'll just get Bond off to do some motor racing and we'll try and hang it around a very thin idea of why he has to do this. But they do so, and it all comes together as Bond has to protect Bond has to protect the racer Lancey Smith, who I don't know if you know that in the original outline was meant to be Sterling Moss.
Yes.
They were going to use the real racing driver Sterling Moss as the character, but when Horowitz got his hands on it, he decided.
Yeah, they would be distracting almost. I really loved the racing scene. I think it is a definite highlight of the book. I thought the race itself was credible and exciting, and it had literal twists and turns as well as narrative twists and turns. What was your take on that?
I think I really enjoyed that as well. I think because it has that Fleming mixture of good writing and being thrilling, but with that sort of journalistic edge to it. Again, if you look, I talked about not being a huge fan of Goldfinger, but I really appreciate the golf sequence. And I know bugger all about golf.
It's so funny how he makes golf exciting in that book. I mean, it should not be. This should not
exactly. And he manages, and he's partly again by doing that journalism thing where he's explaining some things to you. He's using lots of details. And you feel like you're learning some stuff that you don't necessarily know, but it doesn't feel too didactic. It doesn't feel too, I'm going to teach you the rules about whatever throughout Fleming novels, whether it be cards or whether it be poker or whether it be golf or whether it be motor racing. You feel that you understand what's going on. And indeed, it is thrilling. He does that great thing of manage to marry detail with some high-octane action. And obviously with, as I say, it's meant to be chapter 7, which is where Horowitz took the bulk of the stuff from. Originally, the chapter 7 is called Murder on Wheels, and I think that was the name of the original treatment.
I like the way that it also describes sort of the milieu of the racing driver, this sort of world which is going to come into more and more sort of prominence as the media take over, and you'll get Le Mans and all that sort of stuff, and Steve McQueen and James Hunt, and it becomes flashy and glamorous, but it's almost in its nascent form here.
And you believe it. You believe it enough that that there are enough rich playboys who want to get into. I mean, again, if you transpose this to the modern world, imagine Daniel Craig walking in and, yes, we believe that the Chinese want to beat one of our racers so you'll be going to Silverstone and we want you to suddenly be a driver. All of it would be completely unbelievable and completely, this is bollocks.
But it's a sort of Mr. Ben of James Bond, isn't it? Now you'll put on this hat and go and do, or the Duncan Dares. You'll have a week's training and you'll be the best in the. And
you can never quite. And I'm not trying to be unfair to Fleming, but you never quite shake the feeling that Fleming is a bit like, I really want to do some motor race. So is there a way I can put it into a Bond novel so I can, do a bunch of that and tick it off on expenses and say it's research?
I mean, he was doing motor racing as a journalist as well, so he was actually had experience of this particular racetrack.
He did, didn't he? Do like one of the.
He was like a navigator for like one of those 1,000-mile races that.
But he also covered it, didn't he? One of those, those races in the deserts.
Yeah.
Those sort of big, again, 1,000 miles type races, and he covered those with his
Yeah,
journalistic.
that sounds familiar. The race is great. The race is exciting, and then we go into this sort of classical territory as well of the castle, and we're introduced to the villain. And here I can see again what you're talking about in terms of the correction, because we do have a foreign villain. It's now the odd job has become the main boss, so to speak, the big boss. What's his name? It's
Jason Sin, obviously, it's an anglicization of his Korean name.
Right.
Obviously, Jason Sin is a very Bondian villain type name, but again, it's given a specific explanation as to why it's there.
Yeah, and he sort of quite resentfully says at some point, you stupid people can't be bothered to pronounce my name correctly. So, and I love the description of the castle. I think that scene is really well played out, and specifically the portraits that have had their eyes burned out with cigarettes, which will come back later in the novel. But there's a nastiness to that, and there's a chill that runs down your spine when you see that. I think that's just really well done.
I think and again, it's that thing that doesn't, he keeps his powder dry. You can tell that Jason Sin is going to turn out to be the bad guy, but he only drip feeds you bits of information about who he is and where he's from, and waits until you get. We'll talk about the scene later, which is just Bond, which is a complete bad guy eating a meal around a table that is completely codified by the history of Bond. And it is, really well done. And again, it's very Bond. Bond evades the guards. He's looking around where he shouldn't. Somebody else comes blundering in. This one being new Bond girl, Jeopardy Lane. Again, continuing with the Bond girls with silly names, but at least this one is not, how shall I say, massively with a massive sexual innuendo, at least. And what I like, because really from the racing sequence onwards, now we're into the castle, the book doesn't really let up. It's pretty relentless from now until the end, which I think is really good. There's very few dead spots.
Yes.
It keeps the pace relentlessly going. And so there's again, quite a really well done escape from the castle, done with plenty of tension, and again a little bit of genre savviness. Playing with an audience who also know how these kind of things work. So exactly how are they going to do it? Because they understand what's happening, we understand what's happening. And Horowitz is playing with that understanding that both we have as audience and what the character.
Totally get that, and I love the slightly Hitchcockian thing of like, okay, it's okay to escape from a castle, but how are you gonna, get back to the hotel?
Exactly, and of course you've also got the thing of finding the rocket pictures, and you start to go, right, this is the bit in the prologue now.
Yes, exactly. You're beginning to connect the dots.
The dots are starting to connect, and you forgive some of the more clunky exposition with why he's there, because suddenly it becomes a bigger thing and it does all connect with X, Y, and Z. And again, there's that Bondian, it's a little bit convenient in some ways about how it all fits together, but Fleming always did that. And most of the time you forgave it. Like I say, if you go back to Goldfinger, I have a problem with a couple of things, which is, again, I find Goldfinger taking Bond as a secretary for all intents and purposes as a step too far. And Bond's final way of, contacting the authorities, which is just by a piece of paper, hoping somebody finds it, is a little bit too much for me. But Bond was always about wild improbability, and most of the time, you let it go. And within this novel, I can let things go because it's done with enough verve and pace that with this one, the improbabilities are allowed within the world of Bond.
There are sections of this book where you feel like there's a real action sequences are coming in. And I'm wondering as well if this is part of having to address Bond and the phenomena of Bond as a cultural thing rather than just the Fleming version of Bond. So I'll give you sort of examples. I thought all the thing about going to America and confronting the sort of military top brass about what's going on and setting and investigating and working out what was going on with Jason Sin. I thought all of that was great, and I was really into it. And I always like Bond coming up against hard-nosed Americans who can't quite figure this guy out. His institutional role is always unclear, and he doesn't sort of make much of an effort to. And I also liked the reveal that Jeopardy is this sort of what, she belonged to the Treasury or something?
Yeah, she's working for the US Treasury.
Yeah, exactly. And there's that sense that there isn't a huge amount of institutional oversight. She's just having a look into this on her own account, really, which I find really, really interesting. But then when we get into really exciting territory where with the attack on his hotel room, and as you say, from that stage on, it's the attack on his hotel room, him being buried alive, and then the underground railway chase. It sort of seamlessly blends from one into the other, and it's a fascinating sort of way of ending the novel.
I think, again, is that continuation of the pace, and I think it's something to do again with the cultural cachet of Bond. By that point, you don't need to explain as much because it's Bond. This is the kind of shit that he does. Yeah. If you know what I mean. It's like, I think if you buried Bond alive in the first couple of Fleming novels, even Bond fans would be going, this is stretching it a bit. Whereas by the time of something like this, you can bury Bond alive and you can have him get out because it's James bloody Bond. With that, he is playing with that character because we know that if anybody can do it, it's Bond. And you don't question it, if you know what I mean. And again, it does, I bet you, that like Fleming probably would have, Horowitz probably had talked to a doctor, talked to a thing, and has said, so do you think somebody could actually survive being buried alive and what, because there's always the bit about Bond working out how much air he's got. Again, it's these exciting things, but with that little journalistic edge to give it some sort of credibility. And that goes throughout the train, even the train station chase, that's just a little bit before, where there's loads of facts.
Yes.
About the American subway system and American trains and all that kind of stuff. And that is very Fleming. It was always this marrying of Fleming's journalistic attention to details to the completely outre, over-the-topness of what was happening. But because they were married, you sort of let things go because one seemed to balance the other thing. And I think he does that really well here, that you have all these moments that are bold and brassy and ridiculous, but he has enough of this Fleming-esque sort of attention to detail that you go with it.
How much of the books when you're reading the Horowitz books, I was kind of also spotting really direct influences from the previous books. So I was looking at the hotel attack and I was thinking, Spy Who Loved Me.
Spy Who Loved Me, yeah.
I was reading the bit Jason Sin owns this employment agency and he's I was like, okay, that's Live and Let Die and Mr. Big having, it's a racial, the idea of sort of like there being this ethnic identity to a sort of underclass or service class, which then are sort of could be powerfully controlled by somebody, a bad actor pulling the strings.
I mean, again, you have that sequence when Jason Sin reveals, and it's the atypical Bond thing. Villain sits them down in his lair, gives them food and something to do. Although I really like in this one, they basically make a point of saying the food was bad and the wine's not very good. Yeah, usually it was always to do with. So it's a shame to be sat here when I'm eating such good food and good wine because, you're such an evil person. I just like the fact in this one, he's not just evil because he's evil, but can't serve good food and decent wine. That's just the extra little topper. And it is totally that moment is totally. It's Dr. No. It's not only coming from, but with that moment, it's not just Fleming. That has codified as, it's the same as Christie and...
It's Austin Powers.
The same as Christie and the denouement in the billiard room. Right. And everybody gathered in the thing. That has become a thing. Bond gathering, the villains gathering Bond in his lair to tell him his plan and to, such a classic thing. And I think he does it well. And again, there's slightly playing, it's one of the most gritty and realistic things in the book when Sin is talking about the massacre.
Yes, I mean that strikes me as almost not a Bond book in a way. That strikes me as the passage that really sticks out as being, and it's like that's where it becomes a John le Carré book.
Then that's the most, because first of all, it is a credible and very realistic motivation for a villain. You can't help feel some sympathy with him. Most of the villains in Fleming are usually, pardon my language, arseholes. There isn't anything beyond that, apart from the fact that they want the best. You know, this man has obviously seen some terrible, terrible things. And again, it is interesting that obviously the character is Korean, considering the absolute excoriation of the Korean race in Goldfinger. Basically, the Koreans like to eat cats. There's much more of a humanization of the terrible things that people went through. And in some ways, and it goes back to this, tension between modern times and the times when Fleming was writing. I think it's good to be in there, and I know that Horowitz himself has said he first came across the massacre and knew about it when he was doing foils work. So he knew stuff about this, and I think, he really did his research. But it is interesting how it sort of happens, and you do sort of feel sympathy for the villain, but it also has to continue some way of, you can't feel too much sympathy for him. And it is interesting with Bond's response, which is basically, sorry you feel like this way, there's plenty of good psychiatrists you can talk to. There's and that play, but it still does play with the formula. And again, there's a slight fixing, just like Pussy Galore was maybe the slight fixing of the treatment of her character. There is a slight, even though ultimately the Korean is the bad guy, it still seems a slight fixing. He's given a lot more humanity and justification for their actions than people such as Oddjob were ever given before.
Oh, absolutely. There's a context, and there's a sense that also they're all actors in history, and history is not it's not on one side. History is on both sides, and people have their reasons. I like the fact that Bond is often inadequate to these moments. I mean, even in Fleming, Bond often feels, it's like the Pulp Fiction Quentin Tarantino when Bruce Willis sort of says, they'll keep them underestimating you, Butch. It's that thing that he's just a brute force that goes along. He's not really superior to these people in any sort of intellectual way or moral way. He just does his job.
He's not as much of the blunt instrument as Fleming. As Fleming's Bond. He seems a little bit more cultured and a little bit. There's a moment I'll get to a bit later. There's even, I think somebody else pointed out this in a review. There's a bit when he compares Jeopardy to Gene Seberg. I never know how to pronounce it.
That's right. Yes.
And Fleming's Bond would never do that because Fleming's Bond was quite culturally narrow. Fleming's Bond wouldn't know who Gene Seberg is from anybody else. The fact that Horowitz's Bond can compare somebody to Gene Seberg in a still quite a damning way. There's a little bit of the description of Jeopardy Lane is basically I'm paraphrasing very much here, but it basically is she's not amazingly pretty, but she's all right.
Yeah.
The general consensus.
She'd be nicer if she smiled more, something along those lines, And
again, it's a lot of those moments where you're, such as the moment with when Bond is talking to, I think one of the section's heads who's gay, and it does, that moment where you can't have Bond suddenly be an ally or anything like that because that is not true to the character that Fleming wrote. So the best thing you can do, which I think Horowitz does quite well, is have the character himself go to Bond. Oh, stop being such a prude.
Yes.
You went to public school, did you not?
Yes.
They ask it left, right, and centre there. You have another character have a go at him.
Yeah. And
that sort of at least gives him. And the only bit I haven't reread that section because I really want to see if that character whistles at any point. That would be one in the eye for things. So it goes back to there's all these moments, and they work in and of themselves. That I think, like I say, the bit with sat around with Sin and his justification of his actions, and I even love the stuff with the cards. Again, a bit like Live and Let Die.
Yes.
Tarot cards, but with how you're going to die. That's got the very Bond villain sort of bit.
Also, a little bit No Country for Old Men as well. You're
true, and I also do like the fact that basically Bond gets the blank card. So he just goes, no, piss off, you're cheating. I just know you. There's no sort of like, no way he's going to get out of it. But those work in and of themselves, but again, they work as this is Bond and you know it's Bond. They're trying to occupy all these spaces, which is, this is Fleming's Bond, but this is the Bond that we think you know as well. So which points am I going to go with it and not subvert it? And then there's going to be a couple of moments when I am going to subvert. And I think that's what Horowitz plays with amongst a bunch of really good sequences. And again, I think he's a lot more... I think Fleming was sometimes... He always talked about, the improbability of Bond. And I think in general, Fleming had this love-hate relationship with Bond sometimes. I think sometimes he always felt slightly ashamed. He was annoyed with the critics, and I think he sometimes agreed with them slightly. That he sometimes felt, am I a hack? But do I care being a hack? Because I'm still getting paid lots of money and I'm living the life that I want to live. Whereas I think Horowitz obviously doesn't feel like that. And I think he could go a lot more, pardon my language, balls to the wall with some of the sequences because he doesn't give a flick. Whereas I think sometimes Fleming could almost overthink himself.
And there were times that, obviously, from Nicholas Shakespeare's biography, we know that there was moments when Fleming was lying in his bedroom with his ear pressed to the floor, listening to his wife read out excerpts from his latest novel to roars of laughter from her high-cultured friends. There were...
And Fleming never read them. He famously, I think he wrote them, and I don't think he ever... Didn't he send them just straight to the publisher?
Yeah, that...
And then he looked at the drafts after them.
Yeah, I think, it was one of his methods was don't reread your own work, which is kind of... I'm never sure if I quite believe that. That strikes me as a sort of bravura of someone who's protesting too much. So we have Justin Sin and his plot being foiled via, a really exciting... Again, I think... What this has over Fleming's novels is I think his action sequences are really well done. The only thing I'd say is action sequences maybe linger a little bit, like as if he's paid too much to set up the sets and everything, and he wants to get a lot of coverage of them. Whereas Fleming's a bit more economic with them. He's not used to the idea that they might be turned into movie scenes.
There is, though, just before we go to the denouement, there is one thing I'd like to mention, because I do think this just goes back to what I was talking to, and I think it's a very, just before the train sequence happens, and there is one big thing as well that again talks of the modern versus old school sensibility, which is Bond's encounter with the security guard, with the security mook, as they call them. There's a moment when Bond meets the security guard, and he has a whole moment of moral quandary. Do I kill this guard? And this guard has talked to him and said, oh, please don't kill me. We're an ex-con. We've all been hired. I can't get a job. I've got a wife and kids. And it's an interesting little... We're talking about how the action keeps going and going. This is not... I wouldn't call it a dead spot, but it's an interesting little moment of contemplation. Now, again, this is not the first time that Bond has contemplated stuff. He has done it in the Fleming novels. I remember in Dr. No, there's bits when he's slightly worried about the security guard and things like that he kills in cold blood. But it's an interesting little few pages of moralization and justification that again seems to humanize Bond in a modern sensibility rather than it would have been in the old days. I must admit, when I first read this book in 2015, it'd been a long time since I read Fleming, and I almost thought he was a piss take of Austin Powers. Do you remember? Because there's those bits in
because there's a sort of like they're preparing his birthday party or retirement party and for the worker who's been killed,
because of that, the complete disposability of all the mooks, as they're called in the hired help, and it almost felt like a piss take of that. Rereading all the Flemings recently, it isn't. Bond has had those moral quandaries, but it's interesting that he spends so long sort of doing it.
Well, he has it with Scaramanga in Man with the Golden Gun. He thinks at a certain point, I could just shoot him in the back of the head and end of mission. And that's kind of his job. I mean, his 007 license to kill, he's sent specifically for that purpose. The reason for the continuing adventure, the reason for the next 60, 70 pages of that book is that there's always a struggle inside Bond between just doing the job he's supposed to be doing and remaining a human being that can go home and live with other human beings.
It's an interesting little sort of spot just before the main action. And of course, again, those who haven't read yet, spoilers, so give me a minute.
He doesn't kill him.
He doesn't kill him. No, you think he does, and then he doesn't. No, the only other thing I've got with this is that it makes mention that, there are lots of ethnicities made up of Jason Sims, the security guard, and things like that. And there is a little bit in the back of your mind that goes, if that person was a Korean person instead who didn't speak good English or whatever, would Bond just have gone sod it?
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like there is a little bit of, yes, I'm going to moralize about this person who speaks good English with me, and is able to do that. And you do feel a little bit like if it was any of the security guards, Bond wouldn't be having the moral quandaries.
Yeah, the deserving poor sort of thing.
Yes, exactly.
Sort of morally judged him.
As we get onto the train sequence, quite a few of them get offed.
Yeah, without any shade of... Well, at that point, we're just in full action hero mode.
So he's been, Jeopardy Lane's past with the working on the Wall of Death comes in handy because Bond thinks he's missed his chance and he's having visions of being told to resign and retire because the deaths of hundreds and thousands of people in Manhattan will all be his fault. But out comes Jeopardy Lane to help Bond catch up with the train, and then she disappears to leave Bond on his own to do a death-defying crawl from one side of a moving train to the other. It's a really well accomplished, sequence. I like the idea of him crawling across, trying not to garrot himself, and then dealing with all the.
And then someone does garrot themselves,
and then someone does garrot themselves, and it has all that stuff you'd expect from a Bond. A little bit of ridiculousness, but also tension, excitement. As always, you have with a Bond novel, which is these things are exciting, even though Bond isn't going to get killed.
Yeah,
especially this one. This one is a continuation novel. He's going to stay alive to be in what was the follow-up to Goldfinger? Was it? I can't remember.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, I'll have to look that up.
Was it Diamond? I can't remember that. Anyway, but the point is, they can't kill Bond, not, and yet the excitement is still there, and there's always a little creeping doubt. And it's a really well done sequence. And I know what you mean, that idea that it feels almost like one of those scenes where we paid millions and millions for this, so we're going to extend it as much as we can to get the best out of it. But I sort of think it works because I sort of like that continual. Okay, I'm going to get here, but it's the middle of the train, so I've still got a bunch of stuff to do. And him, again, spoiler alert, everybody, him taking bits off the plastic explosive and using it as his own bomb, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I thought they had the geography down. I always knew where I was in terms of the train and in terms of the the bomb and various things like that. I also the time thing that I mentioned earlier, I just think is a function of the kind of thriller writer of today compared to the thriller writer of the 1950s and 60s. I was thinking of things like Lee Child and James Patterson and things like that, where you kind of have this breathlessness that has to inform the story, which Fleming doesn't have. Fleming can sort of stop at the last three quarters and have like James Bond suddenly on an island learning about Japanese fishermen or something before the final, push to get to the end of the book. So I saw it as a little bit of function of just basically this is Horowitz knowing he's not selling this to 1960s Ian Fleming fans. He's selling it to 21st century
fans who are used to watching films. These kind of sequences,
exactly.
things are not.
And used to reading Anthony Horowitz and used to reading Lee Child and James Patterson and all these, great thriller writers.
And it goes back to that again, that tension between. I think I mentioned it before when I was talking about Octopussy last time. Fleming had a tension between the reality and the journalism that he did, and the sort of the facts and the fantastical nature of the bits that he wrote about and how he tried to make those work with each other. Whereas I think that still is here by very virtue of parodying, pastiching, following from Fleming. But again, there's also that tension and how much you make it work between our cultural expectations and what Fleming's Bond is. I mean, out of the entire novel, I think the most unbelievable bit, and I've just remembered this because this also just happened before the train station, is there's like an hour and a half before the world is built, or at least they're going to blow up half of Manhattan. What does Bond do? He has a bloody shower.
Yes.
He comes out from being buried alive. Yeah. And it's not justified within the books, psychological advantage. But if you actually think about it, there's this really big important thing. He stops to have a shower.
Feeling a bit grimy.
Yeah. And then I think he's deliberately almost like a joke, because until Jack picks him up, he just misses the train. When he starts to have, by a minute, he starts to have those visions of him being told to retire and resign because he just missed it. But yes, because you stopped to have a bloody shower. And in any other book, you'd go, no, but because it's Bond and you just about let it slide. And again, it tries to say, well, Bond decided that the psychological advantage would be worth the 5 minutes. But you still actually go to it and go, wait a second.
Yeah, but if you're not actually on the train, then the 5 minutes, that's the psychological advantage doesn't. If you're standing on the station watching the train pull out, then your psychological advantage counts for nothing.
I also do like the bit that he steals somebody else's clothes, and a little bit later on he does, and Bond felt a little uncomfortable because the clothes he stole were far too small. And I love that, because usually when everybody steals somebody else's clothes, in a novel or a film, they're always a perfect size.
Yeah. That. Is it like,
oh no, he couldn't find his size.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. He there's a great joke about that where he gets the wrong person, so he has to beat up another Nazi in order to get a better fit of clothes.
Yeah, that's true. But usually, So I like those little bits. But yeah, again, it's that thing between taking an audience who are used to spectacle, both literary and visual, and can, again, audiences in the 60s, again, we talk about the improbability of what Bond is. You can do a lot more with Bond nowadays, at least with that improbability, because we're a lot more able to take it within our narratives, I think, than we were 50, 60 years ago. And then, obviously, it all goes off. Bond has the final encounter with Sin. Sin gets his comeuppance. And then we have that thing with, do we cut to Bond recovering then? He's recovering, which again, very familiar for the Bond world. The entire Bond gets hurt and Bond needs to recover. That was always a bit of a humanizing thing, I think, within the Fleming novels. The cinematic Bond doesn't really get hurt unless, again, he's down Craig. And here, Bond is that usual thing of, everything's a bit sore, everything's a bit painful. He gets his bits with Jeopardy. He does get to know her better,
as they say.
But then she cuts out the middleman as well and basically goes, look, it's not going to work with it between us. I've got somebody at home, so let's just have fun tonight, which they do. But then it has that interesting little denouement at the end of the book with the return of, again, spoilers, people. I'll let you read the book. Okay, welcome back. Demetrio, the driver who was horribly scarred during the aforementioned race, decides to come back to get his revenge on Bond. And unsurprisingly, it doesn't work.
A wonderful bit, though. I really enjoyed that moment of sort of like callback.
I mean, it is interesting because, again, Fleming didn't usually do things like that in that way. That's slightly, again, there's a bit of a modern sensibility of Bond, the idea of him having the gun in the car and the car being part of it. There's that little bit of, it's not exactly a gadget, but most importantly, there's that idea of Bond slightly being lucky. That's what I always think, and it sort of works within this book as well, is that Bond's greatest superpower is that he's intelligent, he's clever, he's all that kind of stuff, but he's lucky.
Oh, yeah.
That's the thing that
totally agree.
That is the actual, one of the watchwords of what Bond is. It's always about that he is lucky. That
catching the train, taking the shower and catching the train, Exactly,
everything. He's just lucky. That is, throughout it all, and I think I mentioned it in the Octopussy thing, because I think luck was something that with Fleming during his wartime service, he knew that luck would win and lose battles. The wind blowing in one direction would turn the tide of a battle and completely. And I believe that is one of the things about Bond, is that his luck is always ultimately good. That he ultimately avoids the bullet, gets the right card, presses the right button, puts his foot in the right place.
The car starts when it should do.
Exactly. And it's a little bit of continuation in that, you know what I mean? He's just in the right place at the right time. And it's, yes, partly because of him and his skill that he knows to anticipate certain things. But he talks about Bond being lucky, and when will that luck run out? And that's sort of an interesting little coda but which is, and again, it's sort of brilliant and exciting, but adds a little drama and just a little extra bit of spice, seasoning the character of Bond as well.
So he did the sequel to Goldfinger, the actual sequel to Goldfinger. So the sequel to this book as well is actually Thunderball. I mean, you have For Your Eyes Only is also written in the intervening, it's published in the intervening time, but the next novel is Thunderball. And it's kind of interesting to think of this novel coming between Goldfinger and Thunderball as well, because Thunderball is exactly what you say. That's when he's having to go to recover, so he would be recovering from this, presumably.
He's recovering from that, but also his own excesses as well.
Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't. It's interesting that the book doesn't really touch upon that too much within this book, if you know what I mean. It's like because there is one important thing in this book, and it can't be as good as many other novels, simply because there isn't a sign of scrambled eggs. There are eggs, but no scrambled eggs. So obviously, not all the Bond classics are ticked.
Yes,
because forgets the scrambled eggs. What are you going to do? But it doesn't. There was a lot in especially the later one, which includes Thunderball. You know, about Bond's personal excesses as well, smoking too much, drinking too much. He doesn't really touch upon it in this book. He definitely, he has his fags. He has his. He likes to drink, but it doesn't really delve into his excesses of those. And of course, Thunderball is about the culmination of all his injuries and all his. And again, that there are parallels between this and Thunderball as well, in that sort of almost a story of two halves. Thunderball has that big first section of him being in the health farm and actually almost becoming involved with the main plot by accident, just as Bond doing the racing here and becoming involved with the plot involving a rocket to the missile by accident. Dera, again, they're stealing a rocket and putting it on a train. Largo does the stuff with that, but puts it on a boat. But again, if you look at the difference, I think, between Goldfinger and Thunderball, is that Thunderball is full of the energetic action sequence, but I find it a lot more easygoing as a read, and I find the implausibility of it a lot less.
I'm not 100% sure, but I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy to ponder that some more.
I mean, I'm sure I might get bombarded with Goldfinger fans going, "How dare I?" But I'm not saying Goldfinger is a terrible, terrible novel. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, for me,
to be clear,
it's not my favourite Fleming. In terms of Fleming, I think it's the worst. I'm sure I will have problems with that. But there we go. I stick by my guns.
Other opinions are available. But
other opinions are most definitely available. And,
how do you think Horowitz rates then in terms of the general, breadth of writers who've taken on Bond after Fleming?
I think with Horowitz, obviously, what the interesting thing is that the likes of Amis, Benson, and Gardner were as a continuation novels. They were just, most of them took the Bond character and made them contemporaneous, at least at the time they were writing. Whereas in modern times now, in the 2000s, the 2010, a lot more is made about fealty to Fleming. So that happened with, was it Folks? They actually made a big thing about one of his books was, writing as Ian Fleming.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
There's so people like, they were writing Bond, but they weren't necessarily writing Bond as Fleming. They were continuing and developing character, whereas there is a very specific thing of this is Fleming Bond. And I think he works really well with that because you can tell he's done his research. The entire, how much of it is originally Fleming or whatever, but, it's emblazoned over the book, Anthony Horowitz with original material by Ian Fleming. The entire thing is pushed very much as this is not a Bond novel. This is an Ian Fleming Bond novel.
Yes.
I mean,
yeah.
And I think he does that admirably, whilst playing with and dealing with the problems and pleasures of Bond as a modern cultural icon and as Fleming with his, again, bits of genius and sometimes problematic moments as well. And I think he managed to, I really like Trigger Mortis as a book in itself. It's a really, really rollicking, keeps going adventure. And as a Bond fan, I think it's really, really good how it continues. And it feels like it is Fleming mostly, and it doesn't feel like a parody or a pastiche.
Yeah, I think so too. And I really enjoyed his other Bond continuation novels. Killing in Mind, A Mind to Kill.
A Mind to Kill and Forever and a Day.
Forever and a Day. Mind to Kill also has the added advantage of being set in Russia. And so it's actually a Cold War for the Bond character, a return to Russia, but really us as readers, we haven't been to Russia with James Bond. And so it's again a sort of fusion of Le Carré and Fleming, because it has elements which are very the spy who came in from the cold as well. So it's well worth a read if people are intrigued and haven't had the possibility. And if you like this novel, you definitely like A Mind to Kill.
I alluded to it, and we alluded to it as well, but it's not. I've talked about how it deals with Bond as a cultural icon, but it's not just Bond. It's the entire genre of spy fiction.
Exactly, yes.
How it also knows its place within spy fiction, not just within Fleming's overall work, but within, what was it? Le Carré started, his books were being published in 64, 65, or started being published when Fleming died. It was, Le Carré didn't become popular until later. I don't think, again, people might correct me if I'm wrong. So this is not just about, and we alluded to a bit of it, I think, in the trade sequence about how audiences are and readers are a bit more used to these big, grand action sequences through both film and literature. It's also how we approach the spy genre in general. And I think Horowitz plays a really good game without it becoming too tricksy or gimmicky. I think that's the other important thing. It doesn't feel totally up itself. I see this one, yada yada yada. It knows its place and knows when to subvert and knows when to be straight.
You never feel it's not taking it's never being silly. It's always got a firm grasp of what makes Bond interesting, what makes him worthwhile, what makes reading him not a waste of time. And
it's also, Horowitz has said he's a fan.
Yeah, precisely.
If he does ever hear this, I apologise, because I think he says Goldfinger is his favourite book of Fleming. So sorry, Anthony. Apologies for that. But there we go. And of course, so he also comes from a place of genuine respect and love for Fleming and the character as well. And I think that shines through the book.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, listen, Laurence, that was a brilliant discussion. I really enjoyed that. It's the first one we've recorded, not necessarily the first one that will be published. Maybe it will be. I'm not entirely sure what the program will look like when we organize it. But it's been a real pleasure to have you back on the James Bond Book Club.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to hearing other opinions about more Bond continuation novels. And once again, to Goldfinger fans out there, I apologise profusely, but hopefully we can all live with our differences and similarities.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John.